All right, so this broke yesterday during the show. Okay, during the show yesterday, this broke, where Brian Flores is suing the National Football League. There's a lot of layers to this thing. And I continue to believe that the kind of salacious layer which gets everybody's attention probably has the least resonance in terms of actual lawsuit and the league, even if it's interesting, but that's the part that seems to intrigue the media and maybe many of the masses. I'm not sure. So Brian Flores, after the lawsuit yesterday, now he's come out and he's doing a media tour. And we've seen him on CBS this morning with former NFL player Nate Burleson, of course, is one of the hosts now. Seen him on Get Up on ESPN. All right, so here's Brian Flores on CBS this morning talking about how he felt during this interview cycle.
It was a range of emotions: humiliation, disbelief, anger. Now, I've worked so hard to get to where I am from in football, to become a head coach. Put 18 years in this league, and it was to go on what was going to be what felt like, or what was a sham interview. I was hurt.
So he's talking about the New York Giants interview, and he is hurt by it. Here's Flores talking about taking a stand and what he feels like is making a sacrifice.
I absolutely want to coach in this league, but I also know that I'm not the only story here. You know, there are people who have come before me, and I know there are others who have similar stories, and it's hard to speak out. It is. You know, You're giving up, you're making some sacrifices, but this is bigger than football. This is bigger than coaching.
All right, Flores talked about the reason he filed this lawsuit.
We didn't have to file a lawsuit for the world to know that there's a problem from a hiring standpoint in regards to minority coaches in the National Football League. The numbers speak for themselves. We filed the lawsuit so that we could create some change, and that's important to me. I think we're at a fork in the road right now. You know, we're either going to keep it the way it is, or we're going to go in another direction and actually make some real change where we're actually changing the hearts and minds of those who make decisions to hire head coaches, executives, etc.
Okay. Can we have a real discussion about this? One of the big pushes, and rightfully so, has been about hiring African-American general managers. The Vikings have. The Bears already have. Okay, Bears are a historic organization, and they hired Ryan Poles, who played for them for a short period of time, comes from the Kansas City Chiefs. So I completely understand if you look at it. Here's what it's like. And what I want to do is I want to have kind of a little bit of open discussion. I don't actually think there's a ton of merit in terms of legal merit to what he's saying. I just don't. And we can kind of go through, right? We can kind of, like, the idea that, well, it was a sham interview, like, okay, like maybe they decided on Brian Dable previously, and maybe they violated the spirit of the Rooney Rule. But the fact is that, look, GMs have the right to choose who they want to choose. Right? I mean, look, Ryan Poles took the Bears job. He hired Brian Eberflus from the Indianapolis Colts. Okay? Whoever he interviewed, that was his choice. It may have been his choice before he got it. There's always going to be jobs in the real world where you go and you interview for a job and they tell you, like, yeah, you're not getting that job. Okay? But the idea that, I mean, he goes after the Denver Broncos for looking disheveled and looking like they were hungover. And the Broncos, of course, fired back with the, hey, we got all the notes. It was an interview that started at 8 and ended at 1. Right? It was long. By the way, like, it should be pointed out, the Broncos were looking for a new coach after having an African-American head coach. Vance Joseph was their head coach for 2 years. They let him go. It's very hard. It doesn't mean that what he's saying doesn't have some merit. I'm not saying that what he's saying, that there needs to be a greater balance. No one's ever said that. But trying to say that it's racism and racial discriminatory practice and that each of these things he's pointing out is in fact racism, in the court of law, really hard to prove. And the change that I think you'll see is, do I think you'll see more black coaches? Of course you will. One of the things that like no one does, and I'll do it for you right now. They'll point out, hey, the Pac-12 in basketball doesn't have any black coaches, and it looks on optics it looks bad, right? But it should be pointed out that Arizona State previous to Bobby Hurley and Herb Sendek, I believe they had 3 black head coaches. Don Newman was the interim head coach, in addition to having 2 black coaches besides that. Ernie Kent was the last head coach at Oregon before Dana Altman, and then he was the last head coach at Washington State before Kyle Smith. Right? Lorenzo Romar was the head coach at Washington before being let go for Mike Hopkins taking over. Cal's last head coach was black. Stanford's last head coach was black. USC's, they've had several black head coaches, including Henry Bibby and George Raveling. Right? So Colorado, Ricardo Patton was the last, I believe he's the last head coach, right, before the current head coach. So it's like you're going through this, and again, on paper, those things look bad. But the reality is that we have had a great influx at times of black head coaches in college basketball, Pac-12 I was using specifically, and in the National Football League. We're just in a current cycle in which there hasn't been enough hires made, and claiming racism it's one of those things, it's such a strong claim, and it's really hard to push back against. It's just as hard to disprove as it is to prove. I don't even think that's the smoking gun in this. I don't think he has a ton of legitimacy. Does that mean that there haven't been, I'm not going to argue that there haven't been interviews that have only been conducted to satisfy the Rooney Rule? Of course. Of course. And that's not the spirit of the rule. The spirit of the rule is to create inroads for somebody who isn't normally considered, hasn't had a long-standing relationship. And if you remember, go back to last year this time, or a year and a half, 2 years ago really this time, there was a push for draft picks to be rewarded based upon who was elevated and who you hired in the front office or as head coach, and there was major pushback against it. So it's not that people don't realize that there needs to be more faces of color on the sidelines. It's just the idea of, wait, you have the NFL trying to push for different ways in which to create, for lack of a better word, affirmative action. And Brian Flores is sitting there going like, hey, the only reason all this stuff happened to me is because I'm black. Here's the problem. Your GM, your assistant GM, your director of player personnel, they're all black in Miami. And it was you against them. Help me out. Okay? Brian Flores feels like the scorned coach who wants to burn everything to the ground. And then on one hand, he's like, I'd still like to coach again. Well, good luck with that. Good luck with that. Because if it does feel like a little bit of a no-win. If the Saints hire him instead of Dennis Allen, okay, the Saints hire him instead of Dennis Allen, then is the narrative he got the job so he'd stop suing the NFL? Right? I mean, look, was Brian Daboll not qualified for the job? You tell me. In order to save the New York Giants, right? Their new general manager comes from Buffalo, where they've seen Josh Allen take leaps and bounds and become one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in the NFL. And the man who gets a ton of credit for it is Brian Daboll. And to save the New York Giants, they need Danny Dimes to be Danny Dimes. It doesn't make sense. And I'm not. And if your interview was a sham interview, can the same be said of Leslie Frazier of the Buffalo Bills, who was also interviewed? Can the same be said for Dan Quinn, who was also interviewed? Right? Like, those claims, though veracious, though they grab headlines, do they really have merit in the court of law, or do they really stand up when you actually stop and take a breath and look at it? I know what happens when I say these things is somebody who agrees with Brian Flores, who doesn't really know the biz, says, you're a racist and you're wrong. I'm not, and I'm not wrong. again, it doesn't mean that there haven't been hires that make you scratch your head. Fires. When Brian Flores was fired, that was a stunner to me. Okay? But then you start to talk to people and you start to you're like, oh, there was a huge rift there. But I find this. I think the smoking gun is under the tanking thing, which, by the way, is it really a surprise? The hard part with the tanking is, even if you knew it was going to happen, was there actually an offer? Is there a text? Is there an email? Is there a voice message? Was it a joke? I don't know. But I think the claims of racism and racial discrimination, those ones to me, though there needs to be an evening of the playing field, I think they're claims that don't seem to have legal merit. And they come across, especially in this suit, which is supposed to be about racial discrimination. Then you go and look at what he's making claims about the Miami Dolphins, and you're like, that has nothing to do with his race. That just has to do with how he felt, how he was made to feel. Or just being mad about being fired. Byron, what do you think? Now that you've heard, you read, this happened mid-show yesterday. It was really hard, right? Like, when these things come out mid-show, it's really, really hard. What do you think?
Well, I think that the reason for the lawsuit is what you said, and I believe it's what you said of bringing more out than what we know. I know that we can I don't want to say cherry pick certain things of saying this or that, but I do think that it's an issue, and I do think that Brian Flores felt that this was maybe the best way to address the issue, because the Rooney Rule, again, and I said this yesterday, its intent was great at the beginning, but now it just seems like there's this way around doing it, and every team can always say, well, we had our guy in mind, but are you really then vetting your best candidates if you're always just choosing, the guy that you had in mind? Is that really casting the net? Is that allowing other opportunities for people? And I don't think it is. And I do think in his instances of, I don't know if that was true with what happened with Denver or not, because the Broncos ended up saying their own side of the story. But I do believe that there are sham interviews, and I think that's one of the things that Brian Flores wants to clear up.
There's no question. No question there are sham interviews. I would tell you this about a sham interview. Doesn't matter to me. Doesn't matter to me. You want to sham interview me for a coaching job? I'll do, and I'll tell you why. And I've done interviews for different jobs, which I walked out and got a text or an email like, "You did great. You have no shot at the job." Like, why did I do it? Because you never know who that person knows. That's the whole idea behind it. People have the wrong concept in mind. And I know for a fact that Brian Flores, one of the reasons he got his job in Miami was how well he conducted and purported himself during his interviews the year before. He was a linebacker coach with the Patriots. There were a couple of jobs open. He interviewed for them. Okay? He interviewed for them, including the Denver Broncos, right? And people walked away going like, man, he might not be ready, but that's a guy that's got to be a head coach. And then his defense was very good, and Bill Belichick picked up the phone, and he got the job with the Miami Dolphins. That's how it actually works. That's how business works. Okay, you have a lot of people who are commenting on things that are completely lost in business is about relationships. It just is. How many times have you been told, okay, it's not about what you know, it's about who you know. That's just a different way. I've been telling you this for months. Every sport, you're in the people business. The reason you go to the combine is not to watch guys run in their shorts. It's because you go and have a beer with somebody from a different organization you never have a beer with. The same reason that basketball coaches go to the Final Four for the coaches convention. They don't go to watch the games. They go to run into a coach, get to know him. Same thing happens at AAU events. You sit next to a guy, you become friends with him. You're like, I got to hire. That happened to a very good friend of mine, Kim English, who's the head coach at George Mason. He was at an AAU event, okay, and I believe for the University of Tulsa, taking notes, and Tad Boyle watched him, and Tad Boyle was like, I got to have you on my staff. What happens? You get in a room with people you've never been in a room with before. And you might not get that job, but everyone knows somebody else. It's the 6 degrees of separation.
I don't disagree with any of that. I would say that Brian Flores' point, though, is and I'm not saying him, but for any African-American candidate or black coach to do it 6 times or 7 times, I get of wanting to get that opportunity to interview, to be able to be on a stage where they haven't been before. But I do think that he feels now is a time where now it's just maybe guys are being interviewed for their 5th and 6th and 7th times just to check off the box, because there are common names that we hear a lot. Oh, so-and-so is going in for an interview, and really never are interested as being a finalist, or the teams aren't interested. And I think that's his point. It's not about maybe the quarterback's coach getting an opportunity.
But is that based on race? Right? There's plenty of guys like Dan Quinn. I think he pulled out because he's like, I'm not getting it. Has nothing to do with the fact that you're black or you're white. Brian Flores is toxic right now. He was toxic before. Now he's like Chernobyl. He just is. But he was toxic because of whatever happened between the relationship and him and Chris Grier, him and everybody in that organization. That's how he treated Tua Tagovailoa. And it doesn't mean he's wrong about how he feels about Tua Tagovailoa, but it's the perception of it as much as the reality. Right? Like, I mean, have you ever seen a quarterback who is a first-round draft pick being taken out of the game in the 4th quarter? Have you ever seen that?
No, that whole situation.
No!
Is tough.
Why are we? Okay, but like Nate Burleson's an NFL guy, and the whole interview was, well, we know this exists, and we don't. Like, wait a second. Let's actually talk about the facts, and the details do in fact matter. What was your relationship like with Chris Grier? Do you feel like this was about a personality conflict between you and Chris? You know, I understand what he's saying. By the way, like the tanking stuff, and again, the tanking stuff is the smoking gun in this. It is, because there's because of the spirit of what you're supposed to be putting out there. We've always had fun with tanking. It's happened. We believe in basketball, and in basketball, it's just as simple as play your younger guys and they can't win, right? We've seen about, like, I have a friend who's in the NBA who they're playing against the Mavericks a couple years ago when the Mavericks tanked to get Luka. And he's like, bro, check out who they played in the 4th quarter. And I go and look, and it's like, I've never heard of half these guys. You're like, you're right, because they were trying to lose the game. So let's not act like tanking doesn't happen. I'm not saying, and there's nobody saying, that the number of black coaches is in any way indicative of what anybody wants. I still believe, like, it's like Byron Leftwich. Like, Byron Leftwich would have the Jacksonville job already, but he wanted his own GM, and he may get it. Or he may get the Tampa job. Or Todd Bowles may get the Tampa job. Okay? But it's a gigantic leap to go from I got fired to I got fired because I'm black. Or I only interviewed, or I only interviewed because I was black. Like, it's damning allegations which are salacious, which makes, look, and I get the FU Gottlieb on Twitter, like, okay. I'm just telling you the reality of it. Talk to a lawyer. This is a mess of it's a what's it called when they have the class action lawsuit that to this point no one else has joined in. But it's also a class action lawsuit which is talking about racial discrimination, but there's all this other gullibaloo that, though damning, like tanking games, like bumping into Tom Brady and trying to create a relationship there to get him to come. Those are really interesting tampering charges. They don't have anything to do with racism or racial discrimination.